also be a very poor example of problem solving, depending on the dynamics of what may have happened leading up to it, whether there was open conflict, or even if the conflict was not open and apparent to the children, they just see, oh, mom and dad are divorcing. And so that can set the stage for maybe not the best conflict and problem solving kind of approach. And I think, it could even affect wider family relationships and conflict that will inevitably come. I don't think there's anybody out there that's been married that hasn't had, at least, even if it was minor, some kind of issue, with extended family stuff. And, if you're coming out of a divorce situation, just how that colors all that. And, there's a lot of knots there that don't always get untied or don't get untied until there's some hurt involved.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're very knowledgeable on this kind of stuff. But the only thing I will add is actually back to that movie, The Marriage Story. I was listening to a discussion with the creator and the director of the movie, and he talked about how his parents divorced, and apparently he'd made a previous movie relating to his parents' divorce and how it had so negatively impacted him and hurt him and caused him to distrust his parents in ways, and he never wanted to get divorced, and put his family through that. And then the Marriage Story was actually kind of a telling of his own divorce. So as much as he had deeply negative view of divorce, he ended up getting divorced himself, the creator of the film, and that's not a surprise. It seems to be the case that those who are children of divorce will often see divorce as awful, but they will be more likely, statistically, they're significantly more likely to get divorced themselves when they are adults and have wives and children, or husbands and children.
I don't know if I had read that, but I can see that making sense.
But we've both kind of come down that we're not fans of divorce. Shocker. But is divorce the unforgivable sin then? And if it's not, which I assume that's going to be your answer, then do you think that we can attach too much stigma to divorce?
Well, the first part, no, there's no question about it. Divorce is not the unforgivable sin, and neither is suicide. That's one that often gets floated out there, but that's not what Jesus said. As far as the stigma goes, probably in some circles. I have a friend in my church who divorced probably 40 years ago, and she said she dealt with some of that for a while. I think now we're probably too flippant about divorce and remarriage. Though I saw something recently, someone that we mutually know apparently was divorced and remarried, and it was something on Facebook, and there was some comment about it, and then someone asked, they're like, "Oh, you're divorced? I didn't know that." And he said, "Yeah, I know it can be kind of shocking sometimes for Christians to encounter someone like that, but yeah, that's the case with me." And so I think it probably just depends on kind of the circles that you're in. I have not experienced too much stigma, or I've observed. I'm not divorced myself, but I have not seen that take place a whole lot. Have you?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. I think in most, especially secular circles, there's almost no stigma at all. But I do think that in biblically conservative circles, Bible-believing circles, sometimes that there can be a sense of shame and stigma towards those who get divorced. And I think sometimes even a condemnation, and at times for those who have either done nothing wrong. There are cases in which a partner in divorce did nothing wrong. Maybe they were cheated on, and then the spouse left them. Or even there can be a sense of shame and stigma towards those who regret their mistakes, that made mistakes in the past, and it's a mistake you have to live with, but it's not worse than other sins. It's not necessarily worse than other mistakes in this. And some just have to live with it, and regret that. But the amazing thing is, by God's grace, what can be the case, even for our kids, even the damage we've talked about that divorce can have upon kids, what can be the case, what statistically often is the case, isn't necessarily what will be the case. Many kids of divorce end up having great marriages, that more people get divorced on their second marriages, the higher percentage than the average, but many second marriages are great and thrive by God's grace. And, and so a lot of these things are not universal truths. They're not promises. And we can thank God that that's the case. And I think that one thing I'll add to this is we might often see divorcees as, worse off in the kingdom, but I think some divorcees that are faithful to Jesus, that either repented of sins or were just victim of another person's sins, may even be greater in the kingdom than those of us who take pride in our more successful marriages.
That's a good point.
So. And how can parents help their children understand the tricky topic of divorce, be it their own divorce or someone else's, not their young children's divorce? Kids shouldn't get married, and nor should parents set that up.
Yeah, that's that's such a tough question. I think it's going to depend on a lot of dynamics: the age of the child, whether it's your own marriage that you're explaining this about, or someone else's, or is this your child, the friend, or the parents of your child's friend, or just some friends or family members that you have. But I think just telling them the basics that these people won't be married anymore, and then depending on their age, they're going to want to know why. And for younger kids, I think you just explained sometimes problems can get really big and people have trouble dealing with them. You don't want to get into blaming and to trying to say too much, especially if they're very young. With older kids, I think there's things you can talk about more. And I know, like in my own extended family, as I got older, there were things that I noticed and dynamics that I saw at play that I didn't notice when I was a kid, and that now that I'm an adult, there's things that I see even more than when I was like a teenager. And so they may pick up on some things. If you're at a family gathering and there's a couple there that they're all the time just heated and contentious towards each other, an older kid's gonna go, oh yeah, they did fight and yell a lot, or whatever the case may be. I think you talk about there is, like you were talking about there just a moment ago, there is mercy with Christ. If it's there's another child who's a friend of your child involved, your friend might be sad, or they might be angry, things like that they're going to be coming down the pipeline to help them prepare for that. And if they may do some things that are unexplainable, and just how they can be a good friend to them in the middle of that. And but yeah, there's a whole lot to it, and again, it just depends on a lot of factors. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's good. I really appreciate your thoughts on this. One little thing I would add is we must talk about divorce with kids, even at early ages. We must be the ones that deal with this from a biblical lens, because even Sesame Street talks about divorce. We can't. I'm not kidding. We can't shelter.
It's so
children's
prevalent.
shows.
It doesn't surprise me, I guess.
They will be we talk about they'll be indoctrinated one way or another. They'll be catechized one way or another. And this is one of those issues where the culture does not refrain from catechizing our kids in, and we need to be able to catechize them in this first, and a biblical lens on this. So how can churches come alongside children and families going through tough situations like this?
Well, I think regularly show love for them and pray for them. Go out of your way to do that. Speak the truth in love. If it's particularly as someone who is going through the divorce themselves, not just ganging up on the other spouse or that kind of thing. Though there are times which you listen and you're supportive, and if it's very clear that the person has wronged them, say in a case of they've cheated and run off with the secretary or something, that was a wrong thing, and it's good and right to validate that sense of hurt and of loss. But yeah, there may be other occasions when you need to confront them about something. or even just the way they're talking about them. And I mean, I talked about this a minute ago, but you don't want to speak badly about the parties involved, especially to the children. There's just, I mean, these are tricky situations, and it takes a lot of wisdom and prayerful consideration, I think, before we open our mouths. Try to listen, and we're told to be quick to listen and slow to speak, and so that would help a lot of us out if we did listen before opening our mouths. But yeah, just I think the biggest thing, going out of the way to love them, encourage them, and they're if it's children are involved, that single parent is now stepping into a role that is different, and they're going to have unique burdens, and so trying to step in and support them in that, give them tangible help, if it's watching the child or just those kinds of things.
That's good. So I know of a Next Generations ministry led by family pastor that in these cases he's bigger church, and so these cases come up, and one little practice he always does for kids that are having parents go through divorces is he'll make sure he sends them in the mail a candy bar and just a nice encouraging note. And it's like, and I think that's so small, but I think that can be very big to a lot of people in that kind of situations. And maybe if you're a church leader, don't necessarily do specifically that. But I do think, like you mentioned, find practical ways to really step up if you're church leaders to support the kids, to be there for the kids, especially because I think the kids can be forgotten in all of this. But for the parents, I think every church that has the ability to do so should be able to provide some free and equipped biblical counseling for these kinds of things from a loving and confidential perspective. But most of our listeners are not pastors or necessarily elders or anything like that. And I want to say to them, I think, don't separate your families from the families that are going through these hard situations, as I think it might be easy to. You don't want to, it's a hard conversation to have with the kids, and you might take sides. I think love on them, really love on these families like crazy, and come around alongside all of them in hopes and prayers that God does a work, but also, if that doesn't happen, in hopes and prayers that God restores them and grows them in Christ through whatever might happen in their future.
That's really good counsel. And one thing I'd add too, and I don't know why this is the case, but it's very prevalent for kids to assign blame to themselves when their parents are divorced, thinking somehow they contributed or that it's their fault. And I think their parents, in most cases, are going to be quick to reassure them that it was not about them. But that plays in as well. Just that reassuring the child that it's not their fault. And they'll think, oh, well, if I would have done this or done this, and it's really, they don't, responsibility doesn't lay at their door.
Yeah. So the last question to ask then, I'm thinking about this, is how do we raise up young people that grow to present a more lasting image of marriage and its biblical typology?
Well, I think we have to pray for and work on our own marriages. And we want to have a good theology of it, obviously. There's a number of people in the church, and even who would, I don't know if they claim the title evangelical, but who are caving to the pressure of our culture to be more accommodating and supportive of same-sex relationships and marriages and that kind of thing. I think that's damaging ultimately to the gospel. And so we do want to have a good theology of marriage, and we also want to have a good expression of it and live it out, and have work to have a joyful marriage. And that's not always that everything's lovey-dovey and, that type of thing. I mean, there's some people that's just how they are, but I think most people that's not. But you can still have affection for one another, love one another, treat one another well. But we want to make it look desirable and to be a blessing, because it really is. I think we want to avoid making bad jokes about it, and the ball and chain, and even the kinds of things like, just do what she says and everything will go fine. that's not helpful in the end. That's not how it should be, and it shouldn't be the reverse either. Like, I'm the king of the house, and I've got her in line and barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, kind of thing. Just talk about it in good ways. Don't demean it, and invite people in, even to get glimpses, even if it's your kids. Now, this takes wisdom.